Hi, it's Ashley from Sweet Dreams Bake Shop, and welcome back to my channel where I make a lot of cake and cookie decorating tutorials, as well as give a lot of baking business tips. If you are new to cookie decorating, or maybe you've done cookie decorating before, but you just want tips on how to be more efficient, how to make things run more smoothly, then this is the tutorial for you. Yes, I am going to be telling you how to make these specific designs, but I'm also going to be weaving in some information on how to make things as smoothly as possible. Cookie decorating fails happen for one of two reasons. The first reason is usually because the texture of your icing is incorrect, whether you're using pipe and flood consistency or you're trying to get nice piping consistency. You are going to run into problems over and over again if you don't make sure that the consistency of your icing is 100% correct for you. The second issue is usually lack of control over the piping bag. Now, this does take time to be able to write on cookies really easily, but with the right texture of icing, you are going to be able to achieve this more easily. Are you going to get it perfect on the first go? Probably not, but I am going to be giving you tips as well on how to do that later on in the video. So let's first start off with icing consistency. Now, I actually messed up my icing consistency just a little bit here. You'll notice there I took a really close look at my first cookie because I couldn't tell if it was going to flood over or not. Later on, I stiffened up the consistency just so that I don't run into this issue. You'll notice that I'm losing some of that differentiation on the outside of the cookie. It's kind of all blending together. I knew how I was going to fix this because it wasn't something very particular that I had to do. I just had to make sure that I was making some sort of dumpling cookie. However, if you're trying to fill an order or if you're trying to make something very, very specific that requires you to have those nice clean edges just with pipe and flood consistency, you would have to redo this over again. I do have a full tutorial on pipe and flood consistency, but if you want the short little rundown, basically whenever you're making royal icing, I always use 1 cup of icing sugar or powdered sugar, also known as confectioner sugar, to 1 tablespoon of meringue powder. And I know this measurement is super vague, but use as much water as needed. I know it's an annoying measurement, but the reason is because different climates, different humidity levels, it really does determine how much water you're going to use in the end. And I do recommend only using a little bit of water at a time, and make sure you use some sort of mixer to mix up that royal icing to really activate that meringue powder. That's what's going to give you this puffy consistency that you're seeing that I'm getting here. As you can see, for this project that I'm working on, I am making a lot of cookies, but I can't possibly fit all of the royal icing that I've made into 1 piping bag. So while I'm not using the royal icing, I need to make sure that it's covered really tightly with plastic wrap. I say tightly because if you don't do that, air may end up hitting the surface of the royal icing. And as soon as you do that, then you end up forming a crust on there, and then you can't use it for anything unless it's something really specific like you're making super textured cookies. The other thing you might notice is that I'm using a regular piping bag, but I'm going tipless with it. This can only be done when you are using the pipe and flood consistency and you're filling in your cookies. I do not recommend this for when you're actually doing details because you won't get that nice rounded look that you're looking for. For this royal icing color, you'll notice that the flood is a lot slower. It's because I did thicken things up a little bit. So if your icing gets too loose and you need it to be a little bit thicker, add 1 tablespoon of meringue powder and about 1 to 2 tablespoons of icing sugar, and make sure to whip and incorporate those ingredients well. Don't over whip though, because then you end up getting this really marshmallowy consistency and your royal icing will actually never dry properly. I'm using this little cookie scribe tool, but if you don't want to be fancy, go ahead and just use a toothpick. It's just to get rid of a few of those air bubbles. I say this time and time again anytime I do a cookie tutorial, but really, sugar cookie decorating is just making sure that you're doing everything in the right order. So again, still using pipe and flood consistency, but you'll notice that for the top 2 portions of the bow, I did those first, let them dry, and then I did the next portions just to get that puffy look without having to outline everything. I used to outline everything with piping consistency first, which is a really thick consistency, and then I'd fill it in with a super, super loose flooding consistency, because that's kind of the way that I learned how to do sugar cookies in the first place when I first started learning off of YouTube. But then I saw these puffy designs that I really liked a lot more. So that's why I adopted the pipe and flood consistency. And I only use piping consistency now when I want to make details. If you're wondering about how I got this peachy color, basically I just added in 1 or 2 drops of airbrush food colorant. I know that sounds weird because, as we know, generally you're supposed to use gel food colorant, but anytime somebody asks me to make these really, really pale colors, I use the airbrushing because I find it distributes way too much colorant whenever I just use the food gel. And yes, I could take out my toothpicks and all that stuff, but even then I find I don't get that controlled color that I'm looking for. So I end up using just a little bit of airbrush dye. Of course, if you don't have that on hand, go for the food gel colorant. Just be very, very sparing. But to get that peachy color, just a little bit of pink and a dash of orange. For those thinner details and polka dots on top, I'm using piping consistency. So again, I thicken this up by adding some more meringue powder as well as some more icing sugar and whipping it. Sometimes if it feels too dry, too chalky, it doesn't seem like you're going to be able to pipe it, you need to add in a little bit of water. My go-to tip for standard decor like this is always a number 2. It's just thin enough, but not too thin like a number 1, where I can get really nice details on smaller cookies. When decorating sugar cookies like this, it's really important to not drag your tip through anything. When we get nervous and we're trying to gain more control, the inclination is to get things really, really close to the cookie, when in reality, when you're doing things like straight lines or squiggles, putting a little distance between the tip and the cookie is important, so it gives you time to drop down those lines, just like I'm doing here on this chopstick portion. Now for this, I am using a piping consistency, and then I'm going to go in with a pipe and flood consistency. Could I have probably got this chopstick done with just pipe and flood? Probably, but I really wanted to make sure that these lines were going to be fairly perfect because something like a chopstick is very straight. I didn't want the outline of my chopsticks to actually show. I just wanted it to look like a nice puffy chopstick. So I made sure that after I piped it right away, I filled it in with that other flood consistency. I should also mention how important it is to make sure the surface of the cookie is dry before moving on to the next step. This helps prevent bleeding of colors, which you often see when you put dark colors on light things. And it also just helps to make sure that your details pop and don't sink into the cookie. So how do we get this dry without time? So of course you are going to need to put in a little bit of time to make sure that the surface dries. I always pop my cookies into the oven at 175 degrees Fahrenheit after every section that I need dried before moving on to the next step. A lot of people wonder, does this damage the cookie? Does it make it more breakable? Does it dry out the cookie? And the answer is you're putting it in at such a low temperature that it really has very little effect on the cookie. However, do be careful if you are working on a very, very large cookie and you take it out of the oven and then you try to move it right away. This will wreck the integrity of the cookie. So you do need to leave it on the sheet until it cools, but because it's only been in the oven at 175 degrees Fahrenheit, that will happen well within the 5-minute time period, and then you will be able to move your cookie around. Something like this cookie I'm working on, I will say, is a little bit more advanced just because you have to be able to look at a design and think about which thing is going to come first and which thing is going to make sense. Somebody asked me the other day how I come up with the concepts for my cookies, and oftentimes people show me a bunch of different photos and then I pick and choose from those designs, and I pick the things that I like, and I try to eliminate things that will either overcomplicate things or I just don't like that particular technique that was used. Now, if you've ever looked at a set of cookies and you're like, I was really trying to put something together that would look cohesive, but I'm finding it doesn't actually look all that cohesive, usually I find it's because the color palette is maybe too vast or you didn't use the colors enough. So I generally like to stick to about 3 to 5 colors when it comes to creating a color palette for cookies. I'm using both black royal icing, which by the way is actually not that hard to make. You just have to add some food colorant and it will get there. Even if it looks like it's more like a really, really, really dark gray, chances are the color will develop over time. And I'm also using edible pen, but you really got to be careful with the edible pen because yes, the surface is relatively dry, but if you press too hard, it will puncture it. So be careful. And anytime I want to add a little pop of color, but I don't want to mix up a whole brand new color, I love using things like petal dusts or luster dusts to paint on. It just adds that little zing that I need to make things look a little less monotonous, but I don't have to end up mixing a brand new color. Mixing colors can take a very, very long time. I also like using textures to add a little bit of interest to the cookie. I could have just left it plain, but I really wanted to incorporate the polka dots since the polka dots were already on the bows as well. I'm using a really great luster dust from Jenna Rae Cakes. They sent me a whole bunch after I had rave reviews to share about this luster dust. I love it because it's fully edible, but more than that, I love that it has just a really, really beautiful golden color that I've been searching for. I mixed it with just a little splash of vodka. Whether you're using vodka or if you're using lemon extract, just use a little splash at a time. If you don't, what ends up happening sometimes is it is just too translucent and you can see right through that pigment. So let's get into the pricing of these cookies. How much would a cookie set like this go for? So basically, I would say that the starting price of these cookies would be $5.25 to anywhere around the $7.50 mark. This is all in Canadian dollars. I would also implement some sort of minimum, so whether that's a number minimum or a dollar minimum. I personally would go for a dollar minimum. So for example, I would say something like you need to purchase at least $250 worth of cookies. And just a little tip when it comes to selling cookies, I would make sure to package every single cookie individually before sending it out the door. I used to work at a bakery where we just put them in boxes free unless they specifically asked for packaging. But honestly, the packaging really helps to save the integrity of the cookie. And just make sure that you're including that cost directly into your cookie pricing. Thanks so much for watching, guys. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so you can be part of the Sweetie fam. Right now, I'm uploading weekly, so make sure you hit that notification bell so you know when I upload. Also, be sure to comment, request, or ask a question. I love hearing from you guys. And Ollie and I are back. We just recently uploaded another episode of the Bake Down podcast, so be sure to check it out. Bye!